Ouagadougou, San. 17 a.m. The red light on the secure line blinked, cutting through the silence of the presidential office like a warning siren. On the other end of the call was not a routine diplomat, not a cautious ally, but Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu himself. His words were cold, sharp, and unmistakably final. You have 48 hours. Step down, or be removed. The ultimatum struck like a thunderclap. It was not a negotiation, not even diplomacy. It was extortion at the highest level. Restore Israeli mining contracts. Re-establish the surveillance partnerships. Reverse every decision that threatened Tel Aviv's interests in Burkina Faso. 48 hours to obey or to be destroyed. To flee the country like a coward or to surrender the presidency to foreign hands. For Israel, it was meant as a simple equation: pressure, compliance, control. But they miscalculated. Across the Sahel, one leader was not prepared to kneel. By daring to deliver this ultimatum, Netanyahu had set in motion a confrontation that would ignite an entire continent, transform a nation's humiliation into defiance, and turn a midnight phone call into a countdown that the world would never forget. The silence after Netanyahu's words did not last long. Within the hour, lights flickered on across the presidential compound. Guards tightened their perimeter. Inside the war room, the defense minister, intelligence chief, and foreign affairs advisor gathered around a wide table. Traoré entered last, his uniform still marked by the creases of a sleepless night. He placed the secure handset on the table, a weapon of a different kind. The room absorbed the weight of the recording, Netanyahu's voice echoing threats, promising complete destruction if Burkina Faso did not yield. This is not diplomacy. The defense minister said grimly, it is regime change. The intelligence chief confirmed what the president had long suspected. For weeks, they had traced unusual satellite movements, unexplained cyber probes, suspicious capital transfers. These were the fingerprints of preparation. Not debate, but overthrow, destabilization, economic warfare, orchestrated chaos. The options were stark: capitulate and hope for mercy, or resist, knowing resistance could trigger a storm far greater than their modest army and fragile economy could withstand. Yet the president's answer came swiftly. Never, he said, and with that, Burkina Faso chose defiance. But defiance alone was not a strategy. Traoré walked to a wall map of his landlocked country, the borders outlined like fragile seams in the Sahel. 22 million people. No nuclear arsenal. No superpower allies. No leverage, except one: the refusal to kneel. Sometimes, refusal is enough, he said, but in this case, refusal needed allies. Phones were lifted, secure lines activated. Caracas was the first call. Maduro listened, then offered political sanctuary if the ultimatum became exile. Tehran was next. Iran promised cyber defenses against the electronic onslaught. Israel was already preparing. Moscow followed. The Kremlin signaled willingness to send advisors if the crisis tipped toward military confrontation. Beijing closed the loop, offering economic support to plug the inevitable holes left by Western withdrawal. For the first time in decades, an African leader, under threat, refused to weather the storm alone. And the gamble was extraordinary. Instead of isolation, Traoré was building a network, a counterweight to an ultimatum. The pressure was not only external. By dawn, word of Netanyahu's demand had leaked into the streets, not from Ouagadougou, but from Tel Aviv itself. Israeli officials had bragged of their leverage, never expecting the leak to boomerang back into the heart of Africa. Radios crackled with outrage. Market women folded up their stalls. Students filled avenues with hand-painted signs. Netanyahu cannot choose our president. Workers abandoned factories to gather at the palace gates, chanting, "We choose Traoré, not Tel Aviv." By hour 30 of the 48-hour countdown, the ultimatum had inverted its meaning. Instead of fear, it had ignited solidarity. Instead of isolation, it had drawn attention across Africa. Emergency sessions convened, regional leaders issued statements, and the African Union weighed the implications. If one elected government could be ordered aside, none was safe. Netanyahu's calculation had been simple: break Traoré to teach others a lesson, but the lesson was backfiring. He was becoming the example, the proof of what happens when foreign powers still believe African sovereignty can be purchased or bullied into submission. Hour 36. The assault began, not with tanks or jets, but with invisible weapons. Coordinated banking disruptions, targeted power grid fluctuations, communication. Yams. A flood of disinformation, videos surfaced online showing Traoré fleeing, doctored in foreign studios, false bank accounts appeared in Swiss ledgers, officials were smeared as traitors, Western media rolled out a blitz of headlines: authoritarianism in Ouagadougou, backsliding democracy, all carefully timed to frame resistance as tyranny. Jet, Burkina Faso's defenses held distributed power, kept hospitals and essentials alive, encrypted channels remained operational. Every falsehood was dismantled within minutes by teams of cyber volunteers spread across Africa. The disinformation war met an unexpected counterforce, a continent unwilling to swallow another regime change narrative. The Israeli government escalated once more. At hour 40, Netanyahu called again, not directly, but through intermediaries: don't make your people suffer for your pride. The message urged. Traoré's reply was blunt: you are trying to remove a democratically elected African president for refusing exploitative terms. Your mistake was forgetting to ask my people. Crowds erupted. 48 hours. They shouted in the streets. Try 48 years. We won't be your colony. By now, the crisis had crossed Burkina Faso's borders. Mali's leaders warned, if they can remove you, they can remove any of us. Niger's parliament issued a condemnation of foreign interference. Ghana's delegation pushed for an African Union emergency resolution. Chad raised its alert level, pledging mutual defense in case of intervention. The ultimatum, intended to isolate, was welding the continent together. A phrase, whispered in Ouagadougou, became a continental rallying cry: an attack on one is an attack on all. Hour 45. Netanyahu's tone shifted. His foreign minister phoned with softer language, suggesting a mutually beneficial arrangement, but Traoré would not bend. There is no misunderstanding, he answered. Your prime minister gave me 48 hours to step down or face removal. I chose neither. I chose to stand. Tell him the age of dictating terms to African democracies is over. The deadline loomed. But something profound had already happened. The 48 hours had transformed. No longer a countdown to surrender, it was becoming a countdown to history. Hour 46. Ouagadougou had become a stage. Crowds filled every boulevard, their chants rising like a drumbeat against the ultimatum that still hung over the city. Banners stretched across intersections. Our sovereignty is not for sale. On balconies and rooftops, families waved flags into the night air. Even the hum of generators seemed synchronized to one rhythm: resistance. Inside the palace, the crisis team tracked every flicker of data. Cyber attacks pulsed like waves, designed to exhaust. Electricity dipped, then stabilized. Fabricated resignations appeared on fake news sites, only to be debunked within minutes. The president's advisors worked through the haze of fatigue, knowing that the war being waged was not just on their government, but on the very idea of African democracy. They want to prove we can be broken, the intelligence chief said quietly. If we hold, we prove something else entirely. Beyond Burkina Faso, the ripple had already become a storm. In Bamako, parliamentarians declared the ultimatum an assault on the Sahel itself. In Niamey, leaders warned of continental sanctions if any external force intervened. In Accra, the African Union convened an emergency session, drafting words that carried more weight than weapons. An attack on Burkina Faso's sovereignty is an attack on Africa's sovereignty. The continent was no longer a collection of isolated states. It was a wall forming in real time. Hour 47. The phone rang again. This time, the voice on the line belonged to Israel's foreign minister. The tone was no longer a blade, but velvet. Président Traoré. He began, "Perhaps we can find a diplomatic solution, keep our business partnerships intact, avoid unnecessary confrontation, surely a compromise can be reached." The offer was polished, designed to peel away the crowd outside and fracture the unity inside. But the response was steel. Traoré, flanked by his ministers, spoke not only to the caller, but to history itself. Two mistakes were made, he said. First, threatening a democratic leader. Second, underestimating Africa's response. "We do not seek confrontation, but we demand recognition. Burkina Faso's sovereignty is not negotiable. The era of foreign ultimatums is finished." The line went silent. Outside, the chants grew louder. Word of the exchange spread within minutes, not by officials, but through whispers carried into the streets. The people knew their leader had not wavered, and so neither would they. Midnight approached. The deadline was seconds away. Soldiers stood at their posts, weapons ready, though no one truly expected tanks to roll in or planes to descend. The attack had already been launched in circuits, in headlines, in markets. What mattered now was endurance. Could a small state withstand 48 hours of concentrated pressure from an empire? Could a people stand firm when the price of defiance was uncertainty itself? The answer arrived not with an invasion, but with absence. No jets, no bombs, no coup makers at the gates. When the clock struck, Tel Aviv was silent, and Ouagadougou roared. Traoré stepped onto the balcony, flanked by his cabinet. Below him, tens of thousands lifted their fists and flags. His voice carried through loudspeakers, clear and steady. "They ordered me to step down. They ordered us to surrender our sovereignty. Look around you. I am still here. You are still free. Burkina Faso still belongs to its people." The roar that followed seemed to shake the earth itself. The aftermath spread like fire. Newspapers across the continent ran headlines declaring 48 hours that changed Africa. Commentators described it as the moment foreign intimidation lost its inevitability. In Lagos, young activists painted murals of clocks striking midnight. In Nairobi, musicians wrote songs celebrating resistance. Across the diaspora, social media pulsed with one message: if one leader could say no, so could others. But the consequences went beyond symbolism. Within weeks, 3 African states announced reviews of contracts that contained political pressure clauses. The African Union drafted and passed a resolution condemning ultimatums directed at elected governments. Soon after, a new defense framework was signed, the Ouagadougou Protocol. 23 nations pledged that any coercive ultimatum against one would trigger coordinated economic, diplomatic, and, if needed, security responses by all. The continent was, for the first time, beginning to act as a single shield. Parallel projects accelerated, plans for an African monetary union gained momentum, shifting trade toward currencies and systems not tied to the West. Engineers laid the groundwork for a continent-wide fiber network free from external routing. Satellites, launched under a new African consortium, promised independent communications. The ultimatum had intended to fracture. Instead, it had accelerated unification. For Netanyahu, the gamble collapsed. What was meant to humble a young leader had emboldened an entire generation. What was intended as a warning to Africa had become a warning to anyone who underestimated it. Analysts in Western capitals described it as a miscalculation of historic proportions, but for millions in Burkina Faso, it was simpler. They had seen their leader refuse to bow, and in that refusal, they discovered their own strength. Hour 48 was no longer just a deadline. It had become a symbol, a reminder that the power of an ultimatum lies only in the fear it inspires, and that once fear is broken, the equation shifts forever. The 48 hours had ended, but the story did not fade. In fact, it was only beginning. The streets of Ouagadougou still vibrated with chants days later, and the images of defiant crowds circled the globe. What had been designed as a demonstration of Israel's reach had turned into a demonstration of Africa's refusal. Yet in the shadows, the confrontation was far from over. Western media launched its second wave. Articles appeared with uncanny uniformity: Traoré's populism endangers stability. Burkina Faso risks becoming a pariah state. Networks aired footage of discontent in villages that, upon closer inspection, turned out to be stock clips recycled from unrelated protests. Commentators whispered of hidden bank accounts and authoritarian drift. The intent was clear: if the ultimatum had failed on the front line, it would be resurrected in the court of global opinion. But this time, Burkina Faso was not alone. Across Africa, journalists and influencers countered the narrative in real time. Fact-checking collectives debunked falsified videos within minutes. Independent stations broadcast live from Ouagadougou's streets, showing not chaos, but celebration. Even diaspora communities joined the defense, flooding international platforms with a counter-message: sovereignty is not instability, resistance is not tyranny. Behind closed doors, Africa was recalibrating. The Ouagadougou Protocol, once a draft, debated in think tanks, was suddenly reality. 23 nations signed in Bamako, their leaders declaring that coercive ultimatums would be treated as continental threats. In Accra, legal scholars worked through the night to draft enforcement clauses. In Abuja, military planners began simulations of collective defense. The ultimatum had inadvertently accelerated the creation of something unprecedented: a political firewall against regime change. For Traoré, the shift was as much cultural as diplomatic. Young Africans, who had once looked abroad for opportunity, now looked inward with a new sense of mission. Murals appeared in Dakar, depicting clocks frozen at hour 48. In Johannesburg, hip-hop artists recorded tracks titled Deadline. In Kinshasa, filmmakers began scripting movies about the 2 days that shook the continent. A symbol had been born, and it was already reshaping identity. Tel Aviv, meanwhile, wrestled with silence. No invasion had occurred. No coup had materialized. Yet the damage was profound. Allies privately admitted the ultimatum had misfired. Some pressed Israel to retreat quietly, to let the memory fade. But the memory did not fade, it multiplied. Latin American leaders cited Burkina Faso as proof that ultimatums could be defied. In Asia, small states echoed the lesson: sovereignty survives only when leaders dare to defend it. Even within Israel, dissenting voices questioned the wisdom of attempting to dictate terms to a continent in motion. And then came the unexpected. A Jewish-American journalist arrived in Ouagadougou, carrying more than 50,000 signatures: rabbis, survivors, peace activists, condemning the ultimatum. At a press conference, he placed the petition on the table before Traoré's government. "This is not peoples against peoples," he said. "This is dignity against domination." The gesture rippled through the palace and the crowd alike. Even within the heart of Israel's allies, resistance had found allies of its own. The months that followed layered consequence upon consequence. Week 1. 3 African states renegotiated mining contracts, stripping out political clauses that had long tied their hands. Month 6. The African Monetary Union advanced, creating a payment channel denominated in African currencies. Year 1. The African Space Consortium launched its first communications satellite, reducing reliance on foreign infrastructure. Year 2. A new leadership academy opened in Kampala, training young politicians in the arts of dignified diplomacy, economic sovereignty, media defense, and national resilience. Its capstone course was known simply as the 48-hour protocol. In every corner of the continent, the ultimatum's failure was no longer just a memory, it was an institution. Yet the most striking change came 3 years later in New York, under the vaulted ceiling of the United Nations. Traoré, now chair of Africa's Sovereignty Committee, stood before the assembly. Delegates waited. aware that his presence carried more than personal authority. It carried the weight of 48 hours that had become legend. He spoke plainly, his words measured but resonant. A foreign leader once gave me 48 hours to choose between office and principles. He believed a phone call could bend Africa. He was wrong. No nation, however strong or scarred, may threaten elected leaders into submission. We are not anti-anyone. We are pro-dignity, pro-sovereignty, pro-democracy. The hall erupted. Africa rose first, then Latin America, then Asia, then small states scattered across Europe. Standing ovations rippled in waves, not for defiance alone, but for the principle that had been defended. For the first time in memory, the world applauded Africa not for compliance, but for leadership. In that moment, the countdown had fully transformed. It was no longer remembered as a threat, nor even as a gamble. It was remembered as a lesson, carved into the foundations of a continent. Ultimatums only succeed when accepted. Threats bind only when believed. Hierarchies persist only when consented to. Refuse once, and the world must rethink its assumptions. For Burkina Faso, the lesson was clear. The ultimatum had expired. The president remained, and democracy, tested in fire, had survived. The ultimatum was supposed to break Burkina Faso. Instead, it remade Africa. 48 hours of pressure had expanded into 48 months of transformation. What began as a midnight phone call intended to force surrender had become a rallying point, a cultural milestone, and a diplomatic shield. The deadline expired, but the story lived on. In Ouagadougou, children grew up hearing that their president had once been told to bow and refused. Teachers spoke of the moment not as crisis, but as lesson. Sovereignty is a duty, not a gift. Musicians carried the message into rhythm, artists etched it into walls. Youth who once dreamed only of leaving now dreamed of building. A reversal of generations had begun, from resignation to pride, from flight to fight. Across the continent, leaders recalibrated their place in the world. No longer merely reacting to external dictates, they began to draft their own. Trade agreements shifted south and east. Infrastructure tied states together. The Ouagadougou Protocol stood not just as words on paper, but as a continental safety net. The lesson spread. When Africa speaks in one voice, no ultimatum can silence it. On the global stage, the resonance was undeniable. Latin American delegates invoked Burkina Faso's stand in their own battles against coercion. Asian island states quoted the 48-hour lesson when rejecting overbearing demands. Even within Western halls of power, analysts acknowledged that a new grammar of sovereignty had emerged, one written in Ouagadougou, but read across the world. And at the center of it all was a truth that no cyber attack, no headline, no pressure could erase: the power of refusal. When a leader decides that dignity is worth more than survival, he becomes unpredictable, uncontrollable, unstoppable. When a people rise behind that choice, they become something even greater, untouchable. The night Netanyahu picked up the phone, he thought he was delivering a warning. Instead, he created a symbol. 48 hours became more than a deadline. It became a monument, a clock that will forever remind Africa and the world that fear loses its power the moment it is rejected. Years from now, historians may mark it simply as the ultimatum that failed, but for the millions who lived it, the meaning runs deeper. It was the moment an empire's shadow met the light of defiance. The moment a continent discovered that its chains were no stronger than its consent. The moment Africa stood not as subject, but as author of its destiny. And so, the chant that began in Ouagadougou still echoes: "We are not for sale. We are not for surrender. We are sovereign." 48 hours proved it. Forever will remember it.